Welcome to Sci-Fi Quantum Archives. Don't forget to like, subscribe and explore. There was nothing unusual about the footage, at first. Just a drone scan from '98, captured in late August when the birch leaves were just beginning to dull at the edges. No wind. No rain. Just that dry kind of silence that settles in after too many days without weather. The forest canopy spread wide across the screen, an endless patchwork of green and gold, steady, obedient to the drone's slow arc. He'd seen hundreds of these. Stored them, catalogued them, discarded most. This one had been misfiled. Wrong region, wrong year. Shouldn't have surfaced at all, except the sorting algorithm flagged a duplicate ID. He clicked through absently, waiting for the frame to load, thinking of lunch. Somewhere between the 37th and 38th second mark, the trees shifted. Not one or two. All of them. Uniform. Precise. Eastward. Just a nudge. Just enough to register in the upper canopy lines. Like watching 1,000 metronomes recalibrate, all in sync, all in silence. He replayed it. Stopped it. Dragged the slider. Blinked. Watched again. The shift held for 3 seconds. Then everything resumed. Normal sway, random orientation, nothing out of place. No cut in the footage, no signal glitch. No timestamp jump. A hand hovered over the keyboard longer than necessary. Muscles in the wrist taut, as if unsure whether to rewind or walk away. The timestamp remained fixed. 13 hours 8 minutes and 42 seconds to 13 hours 8 minutes and 45 seconds. He checked it twice. The seconds were real. The seconds were there. He moved to full screen, adjusted the contrast, replayed it in quarter speed. Every treetop on that horizon edged east. Nothing else moved. Not a single cloud. Not the undergrowth. Not even the drone's telemetry wavered. He looked away, as if expecting the movement to have been a trick of the eye, some residual twitch from too much screen time. But when the eyes returned to the monitor, the shift played back again, identical. Trees tipping east, like drawn by a single unseen line, responding not to gravity, not to wind, but to something unmarked. For a moment the room felt smaller. The air heavier. He opened the file's metadata. The GPS coordinates landed him in central Finland. He knew the forest, had walked through it years ago, surveying firebreak. The soil there was soft, mineral-rich. Nothing in that terrain would cause root systems to slip or trunks to lean, not without stress. He had mapped those inclines by hand. It wasn't a landslide. Couldn't have been. He ran the seismic records for that date, flatline. Atmospheric logs, unremarkable. Drone sensors picked up no acceleration, no change in altitude. Just forward drift. Nothing abrupt. He muted the speakers, even though the clip had no sound. A habit. Something about the silence was pressing too close. The stillness in the room no longer matched the stillness in the footage. His jaw clicked slightly when he adjusted his bite, a nervous tic from old fieldwork. He stood, walked to the window, looked out. Wind was calm, trees outside indifferent. He sat again, but slower this time. A cursor hovered over the export tab. He didn't click it. Instead, he opened another scan, this one from Mongolia. Late August, same year. Different drone. He keyed in 1308 local. Fast-forwarded. Trees on that ridge. Not identical, but unmistakable, leaned east at 13 hours 8 minutes and 42 seconds. The motion was faint. Barely there. A tilt rather than a bend. But it happened. Same duration. Same stillness. Another clip from Oregon. Another from Siberia. Another from a thermal scan off the Amazon basin. Some were infrared. Some were high-res LiDAR. All silent. All captured at the same 3-second interval. He didn't blink as much anymore. The eyes held steady. He'd stopped rubbing his hands together, stopped sipping from the thermos. The silence wasn't just around him now. It had seeped into him, as if the moment he'd seen couldn't be unheard. Nothing in 30 years of forestry. Not fires, not infestations, not storms, had ever taught him what to do with trees that moved without cause. Trees that remembered a direction. The next video cued itself, its thumbnail frozen at 13 hours 8 minutes and 41 seconds. He didn't press play. A request for additional datasets went out before sunrise. Remote archive centers in Canada, South America, and Southeast Asia. No formal language. Just an old credential code, a note about comparative vegetation studies, and a promise to return result. The inbox filled faster than expected. Everyone had something, though no one knew why they were sending it. LiDAR scans loaded one after another, some grainy, some high resolution, some pulled from systems that hadn't been touched in years. The file names varied, but the timestamps kept echoing back the same sequence. He ran them side by side, overlaying each forest canopy in translucent layers. Ontario pine, Patagonian beech, Congo hardwood, Bornean dipterocarp. Different species, different latitudes, different soil chemistries. But the motion was the same. 1 degree. Eastward. No more. No less. A unified lean that erased borders and climates, crossing continents without hesitation. The kind of alignment that doesn't happen without intent. The screen turned into a global pulse. Tree after tree, forest after forest, frozen at the same 3 seconds. Every motion registered in clean digital frames. Every still image gave up a slant that should not have been there. No tectonic record explained it. No wind model accounted for the precision. These were rooted systems. Some hundreds of years old. Some thousands. Old growth untouched by roads or logging. Places where the forest hadn't been walked in decades. Yet the tilt was measurable, repeatable, locked into the scan like a fingerprint no one noticed at the time. Data logs were clean. Equipment checks passed. Calibration files uncorrupted. The tilt didn't come from the machines. It was in the trees themselves. A slow breath dragged across the room. Not out of fear. Not quite. It was the weight of consistency. The kind that doesn't suggest coincidence. Not a glitch. Not drift. Something else. Something that reached through every wooded corner of the planet and marked the same directional intent without force or noise. He adjusted the angle of comparison. Brought the Canadian scan into direct overlay with the one from Borneo. Matched by minute degrees. Identical. Not approximate. Not close. Exact. The cursor hovered above the analysis output. Lines plotted in red across the canopy grid. Eastward. Always east. It felt less like trees were moved, and more like something had passed through them. As if their roots had received a signal, and the trunks obliged. But signals don't come without sources, and none had left a trace. Messages arrived in the inbox, asking if he needed more data. One offered drone footage from Brazil. Another mentioned ground-penetrating radar in Kalimantan. People didn't know what they were helping with. They just wanted to know if he saw it too. He stopped responding. Instead, he created a loop of the overlays, slowed to a crawl, then looped again. Forests leaning like a breath passed beneath them. Perfect symmetry. No variation. A planetary movement so subtle it escaped notice for 25 years. Outside, wind touched the branches of a single spruce. Just one. The others stood still. He hadn't noticed that before. He searched for something older than the trees. The satellite logs weren't easy to access. Too old, too obsolete, buried behind layers of bureaucracy and archival dust. But he still had clearance from a consulting job years ago, and no one had bothered to revoke it. Not from a system most thought retired. The ESA server crawled under low load. He moved through timestamps manually. Solar observation data had always fascinated him. The precision, the rhythm, the illusion of predictability. This time, he wasn't looking for light. He was looking for its absence. On the third pass through the logs, he saw it. A perfect gap at 13 hours 8 minutes and 42 seconds. Not missing. Not corrupted. Just quiet. 3 seconds of zero flux. No flare, no spike, no disruption pattern. Flat line. But not dark. Not dead. The sun was there. The sensors were active. But nothing arrived. Solar radiation charts showed no pulse during the window. Atmospheric readings didn't drop. They didn't spike either. They held. As if every molecule paused, suspended in the space between intention and reaction. Weather balloons launched during the event recorded minor anomalies. Pressure consistency where variation should exist. Nothing that set off alarms. Nothing loud. It had been logged, tagged, and passed over. Too short to qualify as an event. Too symmetrical to suggest malfunction. Other satellites confirmed it. Japanese orbital relays, American defense scopes, Chinese weather monitors. All registered the same anomaly. Solar data muted, not erased. Light still visible. Heat levels unchanged. But the activity that defined the sun's constant pulse was absent, replaced with something that couldn't be named. He compared the waveform across instruments. Every line flat during the same interval. No drift in signal delay. No solar wind interference. Not even cosmic noise. Whatever had happened wasn't caused by the sun. It was something that had reached Earth, moved through every layer of detection, and passed without bending a single rule of known physics. But it touched everything anyway. Trees responded. Data blinked. Satellites recorded. No one remembered. He searched for analog logs, hoping for imperfection. Static, burn marks, visual distortion, anything inconsistent enough to blame. But the tapes showed continuity. No jump. No sign of power loss. Just smooth silence carried forward, as if nothing at all had passed. 3 seconds where nothing new entered the planet and nothing left. Not light. Not energy. Not thought. The satellite array had logged it like any other quiet window in deep space observation. But those gaps never came with global vegetation shift. Those gaps didn't cause fungal networks to release spores in unity. They didn't push trees to orient their trunks toward a silent point on the eastern sky. On paper, it was nothing. But nothing had left a shape. The first call wasn't planned. It came hours after the final overlay confirmed the tilt wasn't regional. Fingers hovered over the send button for too long, hesitant not from doubt but from the weight of what might follow. The number hadn't changed in over a decade. No greeting, just a quiet voice asking if something was wrong. A single folder was shared. No explanation attached. Just coordinates, timestamps, and raw LiDAR. Response came in less than 20 minutes. A question, not a comment. Had he checked the magnetic data? The files were already being opened. Earth's geomagnetic readings showed no surge. No drop. What stood out was the absence of any movement at all. The magnetosphere held still, not stabilized, not calm. Stop. The kind of quiet that doesn't come from balance but from interruption. They pulled logs from multiple observatories. Iceland. Namibia. Tasmania. Same interval. Same freeze. Readings fell flat across different models, across different instruments. The planet's shield hadn't weakened. It had paused, mid-pulse, as though waiting for something to pass overhead. Atmospheric data was next. No irregularities on the surface. No radiation spikes in the stratosphere. But instruments that track high-altitude turbulence showed a thin layer of arrested motion. Jet streams hesitated. Airflow lines, usually chaotic, straightened. For 3 seconds, the upper atmosphere behaved as if drawn inward, coiled into silence. Seismic charts revealed another layer. No tremor registered at 13:08 and 42 seconds universal time coordinated across any known fault line. No tectonic pressure anywhere on record. Not low, not stable, absent. Global seismographs fell to baseline in unison, like a world holding breath. No movement in rock or crust. Just a blank band of stillness. Across private research forums, quiet messages began to appear. Botanists comparing anomalies in chlorophyll behavior. Microbiologists reviewing synchronized responses in algae bloom patterns. Mycological labs submitting identical spore release events, logged months apart but time-stamped to the same blackout. They weren't coordinated. No trend had been posted. No theory offered. Just questions. All of them aimed at a moment none of them remembered witnessing. A field recorder in Malaysia submitted a clip of a rainforest soundscape that dipped into total silence at the exact time. No insects. No birds. Not even background noise from the recorder itself. Like the signal had been erased, not muted. A herpetologist from Arizona noticed tortoise hatchlings veered eastward after the event, across multiple brood. Soil had not shifted. No light source changed. Orientation adjusted without environmental cue. A coastal researcher in Norway published tidal readings from a remote buoy. The wave crest expected at 13 hours 8 minutes and 43 seconds never arrived. It was not delayed. It was not absorbed. It simply did not exist. None of the contributors knew each other. Most had no idea their data fit into something larger. Yet every anomaly pointed to the same second, the same direction, the same absence. Silence wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of something else. Every point of measurement, biological, atmospheric, geological, registered the same refusal to behave. Not collapse. Not chaos. Not noise. Stillness with direction. Motion with no force. Alignment without instruction. The inbox began filling faster than it could be emptied. Not with conclusions, but with confirmations. People looking for patterns they hadn't known they were part of. The moment had not been felt, but it had been answered. It began with the saplings. Greenhouse records from multiple research sites flagged inconsistencies in growth curvature. Phototropic alignment, normally a slow, predictable lean toward available sunlight, showed a subtle skew, no longer matching the light's position. The bend no longer tracked the sun. It tracked east. Botanists recalibrated their sensors, assuming instrumentation drift. The results held. Young shoots tilted eastward by degrees unaccounted for. Plants in rotating light chambers still adjusted toward that direction, even when the artificial sun circled from the west. Control samples failed to override the shift. Outdoor studies reflected the same. Urban park trees, rural hedgerows, desert shrubs, all deviated in quiet increments day by day, ignoring sun angles, ignoring shadow length, leaning not for survival, not for efficiency, but toward something no leaf had any reason to follow. Arboretums logged anomalies in heliotropism. Laboratory notes described behavior as uncoupled. Peer reviewers flagged it as inconclusive. Most of the papers were never published. Beneath the surface, something older moved without hesitation. Mycologists, focused on unrelated soil biodiversity surveys, noticed a pattern in time-stamped fungal bursts. Truffle colonies in southern France. Spores in Pacific Northwest rainforest. Ring formations across Russia's taiga. Each colony triggered a release at a near-identical moment, aligned to the blackout window. Not seasonal. Not chemical. Time. One lab repeated the experiment in isolation, controlling for pressure, moisture, and decay. The fungi refused to replicate the behavior. The original event had passed, and nothing they did could summon its echo. The response had been singular. Migratory birds, usually dependent on geomagnetic navigation, adjusted their routes by a fractional margin. Just enough to show in tracking collars. Just enough to raise questions. Flocks veered subtly east of historical corridors, not enough to disrupt the journey, but enough to break prediction models. Paths that had held for generations no longer closed as expected. No extreme weather explained the shift. No change in wind systems or predation patterns. The deviation occurred only once, across multiple species, recorded within the same season. Timing matched the tree tilt. Timing matched the blackout. Beekeepers began documenting strange orientation patterns within hives. The hexagonal geometry of comb construction, always optimized toward heat and efficiency, began to bias toward a new axis. Slight but measurable. Across colonies that had never interacted. Across continents. Some of the bees themselves, tagged for urban pollination tracking, adjusted flight vectors toward the same bearing. Eastern arcs that ignored flower position. A directional insistence that did not correct itself, even when resources lay in the opposite path. Nature had not shifted randomly. It had reoriented. A collective, quiet turn. The word calibration surfaced more than once. In passing conversations, in handwritten field notes. No one said it officially. But they felt it. Plants, fungi, animals. Each moved not out of instinct, but as if syncing to a clock no one had set. It wasn't behavior. It was posture. The way a creature might adjust after a sound too low to hear. Or a pressure too subtle to name. Something passed through them. Not a force. Not a signal. But presence. And once it passed, the Earth responded in kind. Magnetospheric data doesn't draw attention easily. It sits buried in long strings of numbers, barely glanced at unless something goes wrong. But the observatory in Kiruna had been logging anomalies since before the Cold War, and nothing in its archive looked like this. The field didn't fluctuate. It didn't bend. It turned. At 13:08 and 42 seconds Universal Time Coordinated, Earth's magnetic axis reoriented by a fraction of a degree. Not a drift. Not a swing. A lock. For 3 seconds, the magnetic north stopped pointing toward the pole. It pointed toward a location not on Earth, not near it, and not part of any mapped trajectory. The alignment wasn't predicted by solar wind behavior. It didn't coincide with geomagnetic storm precursors. It wasn't accompanied by auroral activity. The satellites responsible for monitoring such changes didn't register strain. The data showed agreement. Global instruments, thousands of miles apart, all pointed to the same fixed direction beyond the sky. When the data was pulled into spatial modeling software, the trajectory extended beyond the heliosphere. Past the planetary orbit lines. Past mapped stars. The coordinate intersected nothing. Not a cluster. Not a rogue body. Not radiation. Nothing gravitational. It wasn't empty space either, because the orientation had purpose. Something anchored the direction, something unmapped that exerted no pull, no measurable force. Yet for those 3 seconds Earth turned itself toward it. The software flagged the result as a probable error. Algorithms rejected it on the basis of impossibility. But raw logs overruled the simulations. The shift had occurred, not suggested by a model but observed by instruments hardened against failure. The axis returned to normal at 13 hours 8 minutes and 45 seconds. Every monitor ticked back without hesitation. No trace of heat signature. No residual interference. Just a correction, as though a question had been asked and answered. The position was mapped anyway, cross-checked against all known star catalogs. The coordinate sat between 2 points of emptiness in a region considered observational noise. No object, no signal. No reason to look again. But the field turned toward it. Within hours, the alignment was verified by other stations. One in Antarctica. One floating in polar orbit. One tethered to the seabed in the Indian Ocean. All reported identical deviation. The planet had moved its magnetic attention toward a fixed bearing with no precedent and no explanation. It wasn't gravitational, because nothing moved. It wasn't visual, because nothing was seen. It wasn't electromagnetic, because no disturbance passed through. Yet every needle swayed the same way. Every model bent the same line. Every data point ended at the same silence. The coordinate was printed once, folded, filed, left in a drawer. It was never erased. But no one wanted it in the system, because it hadn't pulled Earth to it. Earth had acknowledged it. The surveys were broad, masked behind unrelated health studies. Nothing invasive. A timestamp buried in a sequence of memory prompts. One question among hundreds, framed without emphasis, asking participants to describe where they were at 13:08 and 42 seconds Universal Time, coordinated on August 23, 1998. No one answered correctly. Most skipped it. Some guessed. A few fabricated vivid, confident memories, none of which aligned with any corroborating record. Even among the responses that claimed certainty, patterns dissolved under verification. Time cards disagreed. Phone logs contradicted location. It wasn't confusion. It was vacancy. The neuroscientist repeated the test in controlled conditions, pulling volunteers into isolated chambers. Using deep recall stimulation, she ran temporal mapping against known event. At the target timestamp, EEG readings flattened. Not asleep. Not distracted. Not misremembering. The signal vanished. Brain activity dipped below baseline, matching what's normally seen in near-zero sensory environments. The finding wasn't in forgetting. It was in the lack of data to forget. She reached for harder evidence. Surveillance footage from financial districts, airports, highways, public transport hubs, all showed the same result. 3 seconds cut out, not blacked out, not skipped, but replaced. Some systems repeated the previous seconds in a loop. Others jumped ahead as if nothing was missing. The missing footage didn't show a gap. It showed denial. Analog formats offered no resistance. VHS tapes from family camcorders, stored in plastic boxes and left untouched for decades, showed momentary static, 3 seconds of warbled repeat. No cut. Just a stall that went unnoticed until played in real time. Older film reels, even when projected manually, held blank frames, evenly spaced, as if something instructed them to pause without disrupting the reel. Flight recorders on commercial aircraft showed synchronized discrepancies in altitude logging. Not dangerous, not enough to trigger warnings, but present. 3 seconds of duplicate values, altimeters that refused to tick forward, cabin pressure sensors that froze and resumed without registering a fault. Live television broadcasts, pulled from network archives, displayed anomalies in ticker scrolls. News anchors continued speaking, but their mouths didn't move. Studio clocks skipped. Audio glitched, just enough to be mistaken for poor signal. No station reported it. Live streams, early for their time, recorded through consumer-level webcams showed buffering stutters. Local machines logged it as a network hiccup. Playback showed frames looping in near-perfect imitation of continuity. Enough to escape detection. Not enough to be unnoticeable on second inspection. No single system failed outright. None raised alerts. But all hesitated at the same instant. There were no reports of dreams during that moment. No recollections of sudden insight. No shared hallucination. Just a consensus that nothing had happened. The study was published without a name. The journal that accepted it removed identifying metadata before storing it offline. Not from fear, but from reluctance. No one disputed the findings. No one reached out for clarification. The inbox remained silent. In the days following, a few researchers repeated the test on themselves. Their logs matched. 3 seconds they couldn't account for. No memory. No sensory record. Only a cold realization that whatever passed through didn't need to leave a mark. It had chosen not to. By winter's end, the tilt had moved beyond anomaly. Farmers were the first to notice, those who still walked the fields instead of relying on overhead data. Early growth lines in barley and soy were skewed, not broken, not wilted, just turned. A precise eastward bias across entire acres, too uniform to blame on equipment error. Sprinkler arcs hadn't changed. Drainage patterns remained untouched. But seedlings rose from the soil already angled toward something the sun didn't explain. Letters were sent to agricultural boards, most dismissed without review. A few researchers ran informal surveys. The lean was minor, within tolerance. Still, something about the sameness unsettled the ones who had grown up reading land by shadow and footfall. Forests began to echo the pattern in ways that defied casual observation. Tree rings in new growth showed a slow, consistent torque in certain regions. Not in all, but enough to chart. Incremental spiral. Subtle, barely visible, yet measurable when the same coordinates were mapped again a month later. Satellite vegetation indexes flagged the shift in biomass distribution. Canopy shadows moved in ways light alone couldn't account for. It wasn't wind. It wasn't soil pH. It wasn't phototropism. The change was too slow for panic and too consistent to ignore. Leaves tracked in the wrong direction. Roots burrowed at angles outside normal resistance models. Ground-penetrating radar picked up curvatures in rhizome networks, curves that defied geological pressure patterns. What was underground moved differently. Not aimless, not wild. Curving toward a bearing no compass pointed to. A mountain researcher submitted a paper on alpine tree formations in the Carpathians. The pine clusters showed a gradual shift in their growth vectors over the last 6 years. Nothing visible from below, but in drone footage the spiraling pattern revealed itself. A slow, clockwise lean across the upper canopy. As if the forest had begun turning its head to listen. Invasive species followed the same bias. Vines grew east before climbing. Moss spread unevenly on stones it used to coat symmetrically. Lichens receded from western exposures with no change in moisture or acidity. Even fungi in isolated biomes, caves untouched by sunlight, sent hyphae crawling toward the same unseen horizon. The behavior wasn't aggressive. It wasn't even unnatural in motion. It was the consistency that bent the air around it. Nature had always responded to rhythm. Moon cycles, seasons, ocean tides. But this was not a reaction. It was reorientation. As if something had asked a question once, and the world had not stopped answering. The maps were redrawn by quiet hands. Biologists adjusted models without noting the reason. The shift didn't justify headlines. It didn't justify emergency. It simply stayed. No species panicked. No system collapsed. No structure broke. The Earth had turned slightly. Not on its axis. Not in orbit. But in posture. In preference. And something beneath every root, beneath every seed, had already made the decision to follow. The first signature came buried inside telemetry noise from a retired weather satellite stationed above the Indian Ocean. Engineers reviewed it out of routine, not curiosity, just another system nearing obsolescence. The log flagged a minor dropout in solar input, identical in duration and spectral silence to the blackout no one could explain. 3 seconds. Same time of day. Same pattern of no pattern. Only this time, it wasn't historical. It was predictive. Cross-referencing began in quiet circles. Nothing official, nothing circulated through public channels. Astrophysicists ran the numbers again. The arc of Earth's rotation, the alignment of its magnetosphere, the silent coordinate it had once turned toward, all of it lined up to repeat. Not someday. Not in theory. Within 6 days. Departments that had never spoken began exchanging encrypted messages. The language was careful, the tone unfinished. No warnings. No hypotheses. Just data, passed like objects too hot to hold. Some remembered the tilt. Others didn't. Memory of the event had faded in strange ways. Not through time, but through absence. People who had studied the anomaly, people who had published on it, could no longer recall their own conclusions. Their papers existed. Their names were on them. But their voices cracked when asked what the research meant. Files had to be reread by their own authors. Notes reconstructed. Timelines reassembled by others who had archived everything without knowing why. There were no meetings. No press releases. Just movement, scattered and silent, as if instinct replaced protocol. Ecologists set up sensors across preserved forests. No explanations were given to local officials. Permissions were bypassed. Ground-anchored tilt monitors were installed in tree rings. Root growth was tagged with dye tracers. Cameras ran on solar and silent. Physicists recalibrated magnetic flux detectors, focused not on the Earth but on its orientation. Not what it might see, but what it might face. Biologists tagged animal paths, not to study migration, but to see if anything hesitated. A third alignment was projected. The data was clean. The signal had returned, not with noise but with absence. An interval in time that carried no pulse, no announcement, no radiation. This time, the preparations were not for observation. They were for consequence. The forests had not stopped leaning. Trees no longer bent eastward, they repositioned. Trunks that once rose vertical now grew at angles not explained by sun or slope. Remote sensors embedded in deep root networks captured tiny shifts in direction, measured over days. Eastward movement that didn't just reach, it advanced. Models ran quiet simulations. Most were discarded. A few showed predictions in route displacement that suggested motion, not drift. Directional travel, not growth. One simulation, unshared beyond a private server, projected that during the upcoming blackout, the forests would not tilt. They would step. It came without noise. No flash. No quake. No declaration. 3 seconds passed, identical to the last. No sensor failure. No signal disruption. Everything recorded precisely what it was meant to record: emptiness. The blackout ended before anyone could name its presence, before alarms could trigger, before eyes could shift upward or downward or anywhere in between. Afterward, it was the light that gave it away. Not brighter, not dull, just misaligned. Shadows didn't fall where they used to. Angles changed, slight but measurable. Sundials no longer matched atomic clock. Solar panels across multiple continents reported loss not in power but in orientation. Tilt correction systems stalled. Nothing tracked properly anymore because nothing was where it had been. Geospatial grids, once locked by millimeter precision, no longer held. Surveying equipment began to show discrepancies. Reference markers built into highways, property lines, airport runways, all off by fractions that couldn't be explained by tectonics, drift, or error. Maps had to be redrawn. Forest canopies were the first to reflect it. Not with chaos, but with new order. Entire woodland systems, once haphazard in shape, now followed an arc. Flight paths showed curves across treetops that had not existed before. From above, what once looked random had settled into form. No announcement was made. No agency admitted classification. But satellites that once monitored deforestation began submitting entirely different kinds of data. Not loss. Not growth. Alignment. Roots pushed deeper in straightened columns. Water tables adjusted as trees redistributed weight. Hills that had leaned into erosion began leaning back. Riverbanks curved in ways never shaped by current. The entire biosphere had nudged east. Not a slip. Not a collapse. A nod. Insect migrations no longer followed scent or bloom. They followed geometry. Certain birds stopped navigating entirely and perched longer in places that faced nothing. It was not an apocalypse. Nothing burned. Nothing screamed. But something had passed, and nothing would face the same direction again. The shift touched architecture. Tall buildings showed microlean. Nothing unsafe. But glass panels had to be recut. Satellite dishes recalibrated. Compasses corrected, not because magnetic poles moved, but because the planet no longer wanted to face them. The coordinate that once meant nothing, just space, just silence, was built into observatory software without commentary. It became a default reference point. No celestial object marked it. No lens could magnify it. But measurements oriented toward it all returned more stable readings than before. The trees didn't lean further. They simply held their new shape. The bend locked in place, as if waiting no longer mattered. There was no panic. No resistance. The planet had adjusted without asking. It had bowed to something no one had seen. And no one had forgotten. Thank you for watching and sticking with me to the end. Now, if you believe humanity deserves a future among the stars, do subscribe now. Only those who'd abandon Earth to its fate will scroll past.